It is my extreme pleasure to introduce my friend, Trey Bidinger. It takes a deft and discerning hand to build a world from the ground up, but only the most adept can imbue an imagined universe with such starkly current pathos. Please welcome the only man I know who can maintain a delicate touch when writing about giants, Trey Bidinger.
How's everybody doing? All right, thank you all for being here. I want to thank a few people first. First of all, my folks, my mother is here somewhere, for encouraging me throughout this ridiculously impractical and abnormal career path. Second, the faculty here at CCA. You all have a tremendous impact, whether you see it now or 10 years down the line. I have to give a special shout out to Opal Adisa and Eric Olson, both of whom worked with me for multiple semesters and have been paramount in the development of my work. And finally, to all those in my cohort and all of my weird San Francisco people out there, each of you in your own way have made the last 2 years bizarre, intense, and profoundly eye-opening. In the cheeky words of Bilbo Baggins, I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. Now, I'm going to read a bit from a chapter of my thesis. The chapter is called She Comes in Colors. What you need to know is that my protagonist, Ek, who was 13 at the time, has decided to leave the mountain cavern city he calls home after finding himself responsible for the accidental death of another child. When the caverns were still, and the only sound came in the drip, drip, drip of meltwater, Ek packed a bag and slipped out of Dovodem. He soon found himself following familiar landmarks. All day he trudged along the timberline on the western face of the mountain, confident that he knew this ravine, that cliff face. But as the hours left and night's curtain once again threatened in the east, Ek struggled to find a place to escape the approaching darkness. From his pocket, he pulled a hollow crystal with a wood plug. He shook it. Inside, an umber liquid made from bat blood, pine oil, and ash had almost completely coagulated. Ek had an hour, at most. He scrambled up a ridge butting the confluence of the two glaciers, Garta and Peko. Through the snowfall he looked, seeking any gap in the ice, any black in the white. He scoured his memory for Father's lessons, but he remembered little. He didn't listen. Father was right. Fool. But there, below him, where the glaciers met, a split in the ice, and a deep black within, a cave. A ribbon of red light flashed from inside, then vanished. Ek froze. The light pulsed again, and a warmth fired up his legs. He stepped back, looked at his trousers, thought he'd wet himself, but no. Heat shot through his muscles with each pulse of the light, all his tendons flexing. This, Father had never mentioned anything quite like this. He closed his eyes, but still Ek felt when the light shone. And then, in the silence that windless snowfall brings, Ek heard a noise, like the brush of snow across slate, whispering a single word that he could not understand, delicate at his ear, Mizju. A rush of warmth, like hot sap, spread from his forehead, over the crown and down his spine. The heat slid round his buttocks, hugged his inner thighs, and coiled into his groin. Ek's back bowed, hips drew forwards with the building heat. His breath seized. But in an instant, the heat fell away, was taken away. A new impulse struck Ek, a reckless need pulsing. Ek marched down to the ice and stopped at the cave's mouth. It breathed warm air. Ek shifted his weight back and forth, this pressure knotting between his legs. When the red tendril flared from the blackness, curling at him in invitation, Ek did not hesitate. Into the cave. Ek shuffled down the sloping darkness, buoyed by the damp, warm air hanging in the cave. He mumbled the sound, Mesju. A name, he decided. Someone had called him by a name he hadn't known he possessed. Hello? He whispered. His foot splashed and dipped up to the ankle. Ek jumped back and raced through a moment of panic. The water had passed through his boot, had soiled the wool of his sock. Yet the water in his boot was warm. Ek kneeled, patted at the rock ahead of him, then felt his fingertips graze water. He dipped his hand in. Yes, a gentle heat. Weird. Ek inhaled, seeking the rotten scent of a hot spring, but he could smell only salt. He rubbed his fingers together, felt a tiny grit. How could this? Within the water, something rough and fleshy gripped his thumb. Tingling shot up his forearm. Ek yipped, yanked his hand back. Water gurgled as he pulled whatever held him from the surface. Ek scrabbled back, but the grip tightened. And with it, the warmth returned, racing up his arm. Red light bloomed from an appendage wrapped round his thumb. The glow pulsed down a thin, boneless limb that trailed into the water. Red shimmered onto the close cave walls, illuminating the tendril's path through a shallow channel that arced around a bend in the passage. Heat undulated through Ek's body. The flesh flexed again, then a dozen seconds later again. It had the rhythm of a very slow heartbeat. It attached to something. It had to. Missed you, Ek whispered. He pulled off his boots and socks, set them in his bag, and stepped into the channel. Ek waded through the water, and the limb wrapped itself round his arm, about his waist, and down one leg. The tang of salt water thickened to a musk, warmer and warmer. Ek undid his furs, bore his chest to the heat. The channel opened into a flooded cavern. Water lapped, echoing against a domed and glistening ceiling. Carmine light diffused brightly into a mist, obscuring the far side of the cavern. From that direction, the single cord of red traveled through the deeper waters in its path to Ek's leg. When Ek saw that the pool went deep, he made to stop and consider. But when he planted his feet, the tendril kept pulling. Ek lowered into a crouch, yet the sand beneath his feet gave way to momentum. He slid, the water at his knees, then thighs, then, "Hey!" he croaked and went under. Arms flailing, eyes stinging, Ek scrabbled for a hold. His fingers clutched at sand, glimpses of vegetation, a shade of green he'd never seen before, clumps of blue and yellow, creamy white baubles and gelatinous globs bobbing through the water, all of it basked in red. The taste of salt slipped into his mouth. Ek gripped the cord, tried to pull it loose, to snap it, to twist it, but it would not budge. Pressure built in his chest. He pulled his mouth down to his arm, bit into the thing, but his teeth would not tear it. Bubbles spurt from his nose. His eyes bulged. His heartbeat thump, thump, thumped in his head. He kicked for the surface, but the cord was taut. Ek's mouth opened to the salt water. It flooded his mouth, wet his sinus. Visions swayed, the red growing bright, and suddenly he surfaced. He coughed and gasped, and the tendril pulled him through the shallows and onto sand. The creature unraveled itself, slid away. Ek got to his knees and found a line trailing through the sand, leading up the shore. It slithered over a rise, then dipped into a pool where the water gurgled and rolled with fleshy things. Thousands of the crimson tendrils swayed to and fro. Some were short and engorged, some thin and long, but all of their ends met near the back of the pool, fusing one by one by one into a massive mound of glowing orange flesh that sat half in, half out of the water. The thing bobbed side to side, steady and constant. It stank worse than anything Ek had ever smelled, salt and rot. He could taste it, slimy and insistent, wandering through the back of his mouth. But the impulse to gag shifted to a pleasant tingle. Now, when he inhaled, the scent was spicy and sweet, like the cinnamon sap candy Laren always bothered Mother to make. And beneath all this, the urge climbed back into Eck's groin, his tongue pressed at his teeth. The word, his word, came again, not spoken but heard between his ears. Missed you. It wanted, it pleaded, missed you. It swayed in the pool and waited. Eck entered the water. The creature's many hands unfurled along the bottom. Eck stepped atop them. They coiled round his thighs, pressed his lower back, edging his hips, then curling up round his shoulders to brush at his throat. The buzzing, spastic warmth built. The tentacles lifted Eck up, hung him face down over the creature. Green and yellow striations coated its skin like veins. Fissures carved through the exposed flesh, leaving it split like cracked earth. The skin here did not flex and bob. The skin here had dried out. I'm sorry, Eck said. He reached down, meaning to soothe it. When his fingertip touched that flesh, Eck's vision dropped away, shifting to a fan of color, a panacea of blues to yellows to greens and purples and reds and browns, and all of it melding together. He could not turn his head in other directions, could not feel his limbs or his heartbeat, could feel only the presence of another. Eck collapsed into her urge, let her pull his history loose. He dared to speak, to see how she met him. He asked her to invade. Spirals of white spun out of the color, and with them a voice shrieking loud and terrible, "Mischa!" Eck tried to retreat. Suddenly, he did not want this word. Whatever it meant, Eck did not deserve it. He tried to scream, but she would not allow it. She began to push him away, her colors fraying and snapping with jolts of black. Her stare turned hard and closed, and Eck spilled out with regret. Please, no, I'm sorry. Mischa! He felt his hand then clenching tight round something. And she panicked. Her blues and purples rushed away, swept off to tiny pinpricks of light and a sky of black. And the voice, echoing now and fading to a whisper, then gone. Prickling heat in his palm, salt and rot in his nose. All black, and she'd left him. Thank you.